Hello, welcome to part 4 about completing the AQS and AccuQuilt-Along Scrappy Star log cabin. Hello quilters, I'm Erica Bottger, AccuQuilt's creativity expert, and welcome to part 4 of the Go Scrappy Star Log Cabin AQS and AccuQuilt-Along Series. Now today I'm going to be talking about borders, quilting, and binding to help you finish off your projects. Now you may notice Miss Pam is not here in the studio today because she's off playing with quilts in Paducah, Kentucky for the big quilt show. AccuQuilt is hosting the lounge there, and our amazing retail partner, Inspired to Sew, will have all things AccuQuilt for sale in their booth. So be sure you stop by both places and say hello. I do, however, have I'm not lonely today. I've got the lovely Miss Katie here with me today. She's going to lend a hand with answering all of your questions as we go along. Now, anytime you've got a question, just type it into the chat box wherever you stream our show, and we will do our very best to answer you during the show. Hello, Katie.
Hello.
Thank you for coming into the studio today.
To help and be here.
We love having you here. I love having you here. All right, quilters, now in case you're just joining in on this quilt along, it's never too late to jump in and make this great project. So we kicked everything off back on March 22nd on the AccuQuilt Live event with a little show and tell and discussion about the Scrappy Star log cabin quilt that we're making when I kind of crashed on Pam's party. So I kind of jumped in, and we wanted to give you all enough time to get your fabrics and materials and dyes ready for the project. We've also got details on that day's AccuQuilt blog post, and then AQS posted all those details in their blog post on March 29th, and that included rotary cutting directions or directions if you were using the 1.5-inch strip die. Now, we have had live shows the last 3 Wednesdays, as well as additional AccuQuilt blog posts with more tips and tricks for you, showing you every step along the way. All the videos can be found on our website, our Facebook page, and our YouTube channel. And it's really going to be helpful for you if you're just getting started to watch them in order. All right, we want to jump in by showing you what my project looks like so far. So it's behind me. Now, I've been following the pattern and for the Go Scrappy Star log cabin. So you can see I've got my 16 blocks all sewn together. Got it up on the design wall so it's easy for everybody to see and we can work with it today. I went ahead and added my borders as well. Now both Pam and I cut our blocks using the Go Log Cabin die by Leslie Main. Since I'm following the pattern, I've made 11-inch finished blocks, not using all the pieces, but Pam chose, she went rogue, right? She went rogue, Katie. She chose to use all the pieces and make 12-inch finished blocks, and she is making additional rows so that her quilt will finish larger. So she's got an extra row of blocks on the top and on the bottom. So once that section, in last week's show, we finished that center section. I had to run home and finish sewing all of my rows together. And then the next thing is going to be adding that border. Now the pattern calls for a 6.5-inch border, but this is really a great place to make your project your own. Maybe you want to add a double border, maybe a 3-inch finished one and then the 6-inch finished one. It would be larger that way. Maybe you want to use a 6.5-inch strip die like the pattern, but add some smaller log cabin blocks to the corners. So I took the pieces and just enough to make a 6-inch finished block here. Give Greg a look at that. And then we can pop it up there and see what it looks like on the quilt. I didn't think about this until I had my borders done. So we could put it that way, or we could flip it around. We could put it the other way. And then you'd probably want to do more of a solid border if you did that so it would really pop. It doesn't really pop with mine as much as if it was a solid border. But that was a last minute inspiration I had. So do we have questions? I should check real quick.
We do have a couple.
Okay.
Scroll by, I can't remember who asked it, but she was wondering, how do you store your dies? Do you keep them in the packaging that they come in, or?
I'd like to say that had them all stored the same way, but I have different ways for different dies, which sounds weird, but you know, some of our dies, like our log cabin die, are long. So I have some bookcases and I stand those up on their end like books. So I took a shelf out so that they could stand up. So I have that for those. My cubes, my cube dies, I keep all in my cubes, and I have shelf with a storage unit. So I've got the 4 and 5 inch, and then I've got the 6 and the 8. So I've got them kind of organized that way. It kind of falls apart after that. New ones that I'm keeping top secret or that I'm working on or that I'm testing have their own shelf a little ways away. And then actually when I moved into my house, the previous owners had left a very old, heavy metal filing cabinet. And I have a lot of my block on board and applique dies in this filing cabinet in the drawers. But it's in the storeroom, so.
I'll say that I leave my ones that I haven't used yet in the packaging, and then if I've used it, it stays out of the packaging.
Yeah, once it's out of the packaging, it's out. There's a couple of packages I've kept, but they just kind of get in the way, and you can always pull up that information on our website. So don't worry about it. You could always pull up that information either with a pattern or with those block assembly directions. That was a great question.
Then Evelyn wants to know, how do you use this die if you don't want to do it scrappy? Do you have any tips for that?
Oh, then you're just gonna cut your 2 different fabrics. Just the same way, you're gonna lay it out, you'll just cut more, instead of cutting all the different, like I used yardage, so I laid mine down and I cut 2 layers of yellow, then I cut 2 layers of each color. You're just gonna cut more layers of each color. But it will work just fine for you.
Awesome. And then Jackie wants to know what the name of the border fabric is that you're utilizing.
Okay, all of this is by the same designer. It's all by Corey Yoder, and they're all part of her Cozy Up collection for Moda fabrics. So I don't know what the individual ones, if the individual ones are named or not, but it's from Cozy Up is the name of the fabric line. And they're all of the fabrics that I'm using are from that fabric line.
Awesome. And then one last question. What is the largest strip die that's made? Isn't that the 6.5?
6.5 inch cut. Very good. Look at you knowing things, Katie. She knows lots of things. Don't listen to her. So, okay. Then if we're caught up, we're going to talk borders. So, what you want to be sure you do, whether you're doing 1 border, 2 borders. I saw a great one on the Facebook group with 3 borders. But however you want to do that, you're going to do your side borders first. So you want to measure your quilt top to bottom on either side and the middle. If those measurements are slightly off, you want to take an average, okay? And then you want to get it to work, because we all know fabric's got some give this way and the other. What you don't want to do is just have a long piece of fabric, sew it, cut it off, sew it, cut it off, because if you're off, that can make your quilt off and you can be wonky. We like to avoid the wonky. So you'd cut your average, and then I always start by finding the center of my border strip, the center of my quilt, match the center points, and then pin from one end to the other, and then from this end to the top, and then I sew it. Because that way I know it's going to keep it true and straight for me. So this is one place where you're going to use those pins. All right, don't forget, Katie is here. She will ask her your question. She will let me know. We will give you answers. All right? Okay.
Yep, we do have one question.
Okay.
Carol says some of her cuts come out short. Is that because she's not paying attention to the grain? Or
Probably. probably. This is one die where you really want to pay attention. Greg's going to give us a nice close-up on it. And the reason why is because we not only have long blades, but we've got closed ends. So we've got blades that are going across the die. And that's why you have to pay such close attention to that lengthwise grain on these. Okay, great questions. Great questions, quilters. All right, so we've got your top finish, right? So you want to give it a nice good press, and then we're going to think about quilting. Now, we've got options here, right? So let's talk about what some of those options are for you, starting with taking your quilt to a long armor. Now, not everybody is lucky enough to have a long arm quilting machine at their ready. So if the one and only Miss Eleanor Burns can, as she says, finish your quilts by writing a check, you can too. I've done it, Pam's done it, we all do it, okay? Now, if you are lucky enough to have your own long arm or sit down mid-arm, but you also want to can quilt your quilt on your regular domestic sewing machine, and I know some of you quilt them on your embroidery machines. However you're going to finish it, you also need to think about backing. So think about how you're going to be using the quilt. Are you keeping it? Are you gifting it? Is it a winter lap quilt? Is it a spring throw quilt for your porch? I like using Cuddle from our friends at Shannon Fabrics for winter quilts because they're so snuggly. But if it's going on my bed or if it's a wall hanging, then I always use quilting cotton. So there's kind of something to think about. Now, if you're going to a long armor, here's a couple of tips that we've gotten from long arm quilters. One is to double check on the amount of overhang they require for your backing, because your backing is always going to need to be bigger than your quilt top. You also want to check on the seam allowances they require if you're piecing your back. A lot of them require a 1/2 inch or more for those seam allowances. Katie, do we have questions?
We do. We have a couple of questions relating to the border when we were talking about that.
Let's talk border.
So, Kathleen wants to know, would a prairie point border work with this quilt, or would it be too busy?
Oh. If you're not familiar with a prairie point quilt border, it's literally where you're going to take squares. You could do it other ways, but let's just, for a visual, pretend this is a solid square of fabric. You're going to fold it into quarters like this, and then you're going to sew it into your border, into your seam, so that you have these 4 three-dimensional points sticking out. And the question is that going to be too busy? You're going to want to go with a quiet fabric for your border that's laying on top of, if you're going to do that. I think it could be really cool. And it could be really cool pulling out all the scrappy patterns that you had in the center of your quilt. But if you're going to do that, let's go back here again. Sorry. I apologized to Greg beforehand, telling him I was going to walk all over. If you're going to do that, I think you want a solid fabric here, or maybe a grunge or a tone-on-tone that's quiet, so that those prairie points, I mean, that's a lot of work to go to. You want them to show up. And you want them to show up. It'd be kind of cool. You also might want to do, I know, you also might want to do like a solid border and then do a wider border with the prairie points so that you set it off a little bit from the center of your log cabin. You're going to want to audition a little bit. That's what I call it. That's my theater background, I guess. But you want to try out different things. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about borders too. Now, I've got here the beginnings of my scrappy backing. So I don't always do this, but I bought my fabric liberally for this project. And so I've been piecing it all together, and I had leftover logs because I cut liberally as well. And so I've pieced those together on the back. Now it's going to need still, it's long enough this way, but it's not wide enough this way yet. So I'm going to have to add down this side. So I'm just kind of having fun with it and using my fabric. But I really like how those leftover logs look as an insert across the back. I think it's fun. And it just pulls that theme of the logs from the front. So that's what I'm doing for that. Okay. Now, if you're going to quilt your quilt yourself, then we've got more options to talk about. But however you're going to do it, you're going to need to put your layers together. You're going to have your backing, your batting, and your top. And you're going to want to pin or base those all together. Now, if you are quilting it yourself on your sewing machine or embroidery machine or even by hand, personally, I do not trust basting spray alone. It's a great tool, it's a great extra, but I always pin as well because I don't trust it to not shift. And you will never regret having too many pins or too much basting on something, but trust me, you will regret it if you don't have enough, okay? And I like using safety pins and the curved ones because they're a little easier to put in. But this way you're not going to be poking yourself. You use straight pins to put that together and you're going to be poking yourself. It's not very safe. So, questions before I go on to a little bit more quilting talk, Katie?
Yeah, so we had one other question about borders. So
Okay.
Sandy's wondering for what about mitered borders? And I think that also kind of ties into Cindy's question of why is there a diagonal seam on the border?
I pieced my border because it was long enough. It was too long unless I didn't have enough. My liberal purchasing of fabric did not allow me to have enough to cut solid length of fabric strips. I needed to piece it. And I did that at a diagonal, just like you would put your binding strips together. Now you can miter those corners. That's a little bit more complicated. It would look fabulous with this. That's gonna be where it looks like a picture frame. So it goes together and you get that diagonal line up in the corner. That would look fabulous. I did not do that, and I'd have to look up my instructions on that again because I haven't done that for a while. But yes, you could absolutely do that and it will look fabulous.
And then Deb wants to know, how did you center the scrappy pieces into your backing with the log cabin pieces?
Well, they're not exact. I mean, I don't know if they're perfectly centered. I took those 4 big pieces of fabric I had and I sewed 2 together and I sewed the other 2 together and I made all my strips and I sewed them together. I think it's pretty much in the center. I don't really care if it's exactly centered or not because it's a scrappy back and it's going to be offset on the one side anyway. So it was one of those eyeball-y kind of things.
And then
Using what you've got handy kind of things.
One last question from Maggie. She wants to know what the length of those safety pins are that you just showed on the back.
I have no idea. Let's measure them, shall we? I've got a cute little, and don't ask me where I got them, I don't remember. Looks like they're 1.5 from one end to the other. So end to end, 1.5. That's an interesting question, but I guess there are different lengths. And I've seen some different styles of them too. This is just what I happen to have and they've been with me for a while, so. All right, now when we did our last quilt along, we talked a lot about stitch in the ditch for our quilting. And that was where we were gonna sew in that seam line, okay? And that's a lot of seams with our log cabin block. Katie's nodding her head. She's like, oh yeah, that's a lot of seams. So I've been thinking about free motion quilting with this because it's a pretty busy quilt already, right? And if you're gonna do that at home, you could be doing some straight lines, you could do some diagonals. I think you could do some more formal free motion quilting. I am thinking I'm just gonna do a really basic kind of meander around and do it kind of loosely. So I'm gonna show you what I'm thinking here. And yes, Katie, were you here when I did this the last time? I know you wanted to see this. I think you were just remoting in. Now you do have to be careful not to sew over those safety pins. So to get the machine set up, I have dropped my feed dogs. Those are those little grippy things underneath. And I have dropped those. On this machine, there's a button, there it is right down there, that you switch one side to the other to bring them up or put them down. Normally when you're sewing, you have them up so that moves your fabric. But when you're free motioning, you want to just be free to move around, so you drop those down. I've got my free motion foot on. It's a different foot too. And there's all different styles. So you still have to drop your foot, which is interesting to me, but you still have to do it or else your machine will yell at you. And then I'll do just in place. If I don't move it, it's not gonna go anywhere. It's just gonna go up and down because we dropped those feed dogs. So from that point, if you do a few stitches in place, it kind of anchors it down, and then you can kind of just decide where you're gonna go and what you're gonna do, and you can move it around and go where you want to. And sometimes I do like little, really tight little things, like little loops. And sometimes I do really wide things. It's definitely something that you want to practice on for free motion quilting, and it took me a long time to kind of get the knack of it. Once you get your hang of it, it's kind of a Zen thing, you know, you just kind of get into a motion with it. But that might not be for you. That might be a little too free form for some of you. So Kathy in our accounting department, I'm going to put my pin back on so I don't lose it, has a different method that she uses with tissue paper that I wanted to show you. So she coached me through how she does this. So here's what I've done. I've taken, Katie's,
I like this idea.
So I've taken a pantograph, which is what you would use with a long arm. Here's a design that we had here in the studio. And I laid the tissue paper on top of it and traced it with a black Sharpie. Now, that is Kathy's first tip, is not to use a pencil, because the graphite can sometimes transfer onto your quilt, and not to use other colors of Sharpie. For some reason, she says the black works best. So that's what I went with. So I just did a little bit. We're gonna test this out live and see how it goes. I traced it, pinned it on, and we're gonna give it a go. Now, the first thing you need to do is kind of take a look at it and see where the design is going so that you know where you're heading. You know, you've got a road map here, but you got to follow the map. And I'm probably not going to be exact on it. Let's see. Oh, I want my needle to go down. Thank you. Set it so your needle goes down. That's my tip when you stop. Okay. I'm at a different angle standing here. Okay. I kind of tore my tissue paper a little bit. Ah! Okay. I got my tissue paper stuck on my foot when there we go. Okay. Well, that was fun. Let's see what it looks like. And then when you're done with that, you're obviously going to do more than this, but I'm going to go ahead and tear this away. And I've got my little flower design coming out there. Well, that's fun. This would be very therapeutic to sit and tear out all of that tissue paper. So there we go. So that's kind of a fun technique. And you could write out names, you could write out words and quilt them into a quilt. You could have a lot of fun with it, I think. Okay, so with that quilting, I used what thread was on there. But thread is another big choice that you have when you're doing a quilt. And that's another big kind of audition time. So I grabbed some threads because I think you're going to be surprised sometimes at how the thread looks when you lay it on your quilt. So we've got a lot of yellow in there. I grabbed a yellow. This is a variegated one, and I laid it down. I'll hold these up so you can see. And you can see, probably, there we go. So you can see, that's actually not a bad choice. That variegated yellow is kind of pretty on there. What if you want something a little bit bolder, though? Do you want to go with, I'm going to tell you a trick. So, this is the one I want. One of my quilting Yodas taught me this. Pick out the ugly green that nobody else wants. Okay, I gotta hold it. You can hardly see it's there. It takes on all different colors. It disappears completely in the gray. But look at what the color really is. It's like a gnarly olive green. It acts like a chameleon. If you are having a quilt, if you're quilting a quilt with a million different colors and you have no idea what you want to do, try the ugliest olive green you can find, because it's going to act like a chameleon and it is going to blend in better than you ever would have thought possible. It's just a really interesting thing.
It's a very interesting color.
It's a very interesting color. You wouldn't think of it. You wouldn't think of it at all. This is a really bright green. Here's oh, that blue's all tangled up. Somebody taped these together, which is lovely, except when you want to open them up. I think somebody was trying to be organized.
While you're doing that, Erica, we have a couple of questions.
Good. I'm going to take this back to the quilt and hold them up against the wall. I'm giving Greg ample warning so he can.
Peggy wants to know, do you have to use batting for this?
Do you have to use backing?
Batting.
Batting. No, you probably don't. If you want it to really be a quilt. Okay, there's the different colors. If you really want it to be a quilt, part of the definition of a quilt is that you have a top, a batting, and a backing. But if you are doing something with the heavy duty, see how that green just disappears? Isn't that amazing? If you're living someplace warm, sending it to a warm climate, and they don't want the backing, you don't have to put batting in it. You can just put your two layers together. But the true definition of a quilt is that you're going to have those 3 layers sewn together. That was a great question. What else have we got, Katie?
So Tammy wants to know, she wants to make this for a graduation gift, and she has a lot of fat quarters. Would fat quarters work for this?
Yes, you can use fat quarters. We talked about that on the first episode where we cut the project out. I think that was the first Wednesday of the month, and you could go back and watch that. It's not going to be, your fat quarters are not going to be long enough to cut all the logs at once. You're going to cut from the middle down here. So you're going to cut logs 1 through 8 on one pass, and then you're going to move your fabric to the other end and cut 9 through 12. But yes, you can do that.
And then can you quilt as you go with this quilt?
You probably could. I am not an expert on quilt as you go, but you'd be using sashing between your blocks. It would change up the look of it, I think, a little bit, but I'm open for trying things. Yeah. Like I said, I'm not the best expert on that.
And then Is the tissue paper a specific kind of tissue paper or just?
No, it was the leftover from wrapping holiday gifts, whatever I had on my shelf. Which meant that it was from, you know, whatever, wherever and whatever I found the last time.
Sounds sustainable to me.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Save, but you don't really, I mean, you can iron it, but I would start with pristine tissue paper. I wouldn't try to use the crumpled up stuff that you grabbed out of a gift bag last month. It's just going to be hard to work with. Use the pristine sheets. Spring for the $1.99 and get the pristine tissue paper sheets.
Then Beth is wondering, when you free motion quilt, do you have to start in the center?
I usually do. Whenever I'm quilting anything, I tend to start in the center unless I'm on the long arm. If I'm quilting anything, whether it's straight line or free motion, I tend to start in the middle. Now, not maybe dead in the middle, maybe on the edge in the middle. So I would probably start like, you know, over here and work my way back and forth, and then I'd go the other way and work my way. That just, in case you've got any lumps or bumps going, you can spread them out as you go if you start in the middle. Great question.
Okay, a couple of questions on the thread now.
Okay.
What brand of thread were you showing?
Those were all Aurifil threads, and those were all cotton. They were all 50s. Well, this one may have been this one was a thicker one, so the orange one was a 40. So here's a little tip. You can, the color is going to tell you. Orange on Aurifil is going to be a 50 weight. That's kind of a middle of the road, a great piecing, quilting, whatever weight. A lot of people like to quilt with a little bit heavier thread. You can also quilt with a lighter thread. I mean, there's all kinds of options. Everybody's got their favorites. Oh, here's a little, okay. As long as I got the thread in my hand. Have you ever gotten a spool of thread and you cannot figure out how to get it started? Look at this with the Aurifil. The end comes off and it's stuck in the end. How cool is that? I don't want to tell you how long it took me to figure that out.
And
That's why I tell all of you, so you can be smarter than me.
And then what was the number for that darker green that just camouflaged into everything?
This is 2905. $29.05. That was this one. That was the best, that was the gnarliest ugly olive green I could find in the studio at the time.
And then one last question.
Okay.
I haven't started yet. This is from Deborah. And she wants to know, she's using the 1.5 strip for the log cabin.
Okay.
Do you cut it like you cut your strips?
Yes, you're just going to cut with the fabric strips. Remember, strip dies work differently because they don't have any closed ends. They are designed to cut with the fabric strips. Then what Deborah's going to want to do is go to the blog post from March 22nd from us, or the AQS blog post on March 29th, and it will show all of the sizes, all the lengths to subcut it into. And I know a lot of you did that. I love my 1.5 inch strip die. I use it a lot. But I also really love the log cabin die because it does all of the cutting for me. Anything else on borders, thread, or quilting before we jump into binding, Miss Katie?
I think that's good.
Okay. So again with the auditioning for the binding part, right? So that's kind of like the final frontier. You've gotten it all quilted, it's all trimmed, you're ready to finish it off. You're coming up, you can see the finish line. Now most of the time I use 2.5 inch strip die and cut 2.5 inch strips for my binding. I know a lot of you like 2.25. We have a die for that, don't worry. I like to sew my binding onto the front of my project, fold it onto the back, and hand finish it, unless it's something that's going to get washed a lot. I just love that process. I keep a binding kit handy that has everything I need for my English paper piecing, needlepoint, and my binding so that I can watch TV. So I just keep it upstairs in the living room. I typically sew downstairs in my studio. So I keep this up by my TV so I can relax and work on my binding. Now, if you're somebody who struggles with binding, keep that kit handy with some binding clips, thread, needle, scissors. It's just a really big help, okay? Now, maybe you want to finish your binding all on your machine. That's how the lovely Miss Pam always does her binding. She stitches it usually onto the back of her quilt, then she'll fold it around to the front of the quilt and machine stitch it down, either with a straight or a decorative stitch. And that is a great way to do binding, especially if it's going to be something that's washed often, like placemats, table runners, baby quilts, those kinds of things. But one of our favorite kinds of binding is flange binding. And that is actually, well, let's look at some of the fabrics that I brought in, because I posted a picture with some auditioning, and I asked you all what you thought. So after I had my border up, I posted some pictures, and I posted, okay, what do we think with the background, the dark? I kind of like that. It would be narrower than that. And then I posted, well, if I use this, it's just going to kind of disappear. It's just going to, that's like those infinity pools. It just kind of goes over the edge. I had some others. I haven't put these into my backing yet. In my quilting head, I really wanted to use this orange plaid. But then I started looking at it, and I decided it was a little much. I think it was going to be a little bit much, and you're only going to see a little bit of it. So a lot of you thought, I posted the picture on the Facebook page, yellow. Go with the yellow. Pull out the yellow. And that would be super pretty, although I had the least amount of the yellow of any of the fabrics that I had left over. So then I went, well, I've got a lot of this one. What about the white? That was just too busy. I just couldn't go there. It was just too busy. From a distance, when I look at it in the monitor, I stand back here and I look at the monitor in the studio, it's not so bad, but up close I didn't like it, if that makes sense. And that's part of the trick, is finding it so you like it no matter where you look at it. So what I decided to do was a flange binding. So this is my flange binding. Flange binding gives you kind of two fabrics in one. So with your flange binding, you're going to have this little faux piping look on the front. So I'm going to have my flange be that background fabric, that dark fabric, and then match my border with this. This is going to give me just that little touch up between of the dark between the border and the binding, and I think it's going to look really cool. So let's talk about how to do that, because that's going to be everybody's next question is, but how do we do that? So I used 2 strip dies to do that, and I cheated. I only made, okay, I was getting tired last night, guys. I only made 1 strip so far, but I'll attach the rest to it. So it's 2 strips. And it's backwards of how you think. And yes, I cut a chunk of fabric incorrectly last night, which is how I knew it was late and I should stop. You're going to cut the part you see the least, that little flange, at 1 3/4 inches. You're going to cut the part you see the most, smaller, at 1 1/2 inches. I know, it's backwards, but because then when you fold it in half, because the back, the flange is wider, that's how you get that little pop. So 1 1/2 and 1 3/4. And basically, you're gonna sew all your strips together of one, all your strips together of the other, then sew those 2 strips together. So let me show you how, because somebody asked about mitering, and when I sew my binding strips together, I miter the ends. Let me show you how. This used to be the biggest pain for me. I used to hate binding because of this. And this is my favorite trick. So I'm going to use a half square triangle die. This happens to be number 3 from the 8-inch cube. Any half square triangle will work for you as long as it is larger than the strip is that you're using. That's the key. The other key is that you need to have all of your fabric facing up. So I'm going to take my strip, put my ends together, and line them up. And yes, there's a little kink in my tail. It's okay, because I need all my fabrics to face up. I'm going to do another one, because this is what's on my docket for later. I'm going to get a head start. Line that up, back up with my right side up. Now I'm going to take it to my die, and I'm going to hold this up so that you can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to lay it just along the blade ends across this diagonal blade, because I've already got the die's designed to take the dog ear off the corner. Why not take the dog ear off my strip and make my life easy and eliminate the need to sit and draw lines, because I'm too lazy to do that. And if you don't, then your strip doesn't turn out right. So then I'm going to cover it with my mat, because that's how it happens. But if I do it if I covered the whole thing with the mat, it would chop off this end. So all I'm going to cover is that diagonal line. It's okay. Nothing's going to get hurt. I'm going to put it through just like this. I'm using my Go Me because I was running out of room here. And quite often I do this on my Go Me because I keep it close to me at all times. See what I've done? I've dog-eared my ends. Now when I go to my sewing machine to put these strips together, I can take them and put them together and sew my 1/4 inch seam. And when I press it out, it's going to be just perfectly straight. It's not going to go like this, because if I eyeball it, it goes like this, and my ends aren't even. But when I've got my dog ears cut for myself and I've got my guide to follow, it's going to be perfect. And you're not, I mean, with this fabric, it's busy enough, you're not even going to see where that seam is. Okay, I feel like I should stop for questions, Katie.
Yeah, we have a few.
Okay.
So our first question is, can you use polyester thread for quilting?
Yes, and some people only use polyester thread for quilting. Again, quilter's choice. It's between you and your long arm machine.
Okay, Nina wants to know, is it suggested to sew around the outside of the quilt before binding?
Quilter's choice. There are some real advantages to doing that. I'm too lazy to do it very often, but there are some advantages to doing that, because nothing makes me crazier than going around to do the binding and realizing that something has started to unsew itself. So there's some real advantages to doing that. It's on how much due diligence you want to do.
And then can you use the backing for binding?
You can. You can do self-binding. That's a whole nother technique. You don't need to do a strip die. Basically, that's going to be, I need fabric, for those of you who are wondering. And sometimes I will do this with a kid's quilt that is like the Shannon Cuddle, especially if I want a nice wide border of it around, because kids like the tactile. They like to be able to feel that. So in that case, trimming it is tricky, because you have to trim your backing or your batting and your top to one length and leave your backing longer. Then what you do is press a seam allowance and then fold it over and stitch it down. So it's and you have to cut your fabric away on your corners so you don't have too much, but it's going to work similar to So you trim. I don't have enough hands to show you exactly, but basically, because you'd end up with that miter line. But basically, it's just going to wrap it around to the front and stitch it down. And this is something that quilters have kind of poo-pooed for years, but it's gaining popularity. I know that a lot of the modern quilters have been using that technique. A lot of the quilts that Lynn saw at QuiltCon this year had been self-bound. And like I said, it's a great technique if you're working with that Cuttle from Shannon Fabrics. That's a great question.
Yes. Then Rhonda wants to know, can you use completely different fabric or binding material or colors than what you used in your quilt?
You can do whatever you want to, Rhonda, because it's your quilt. And whatever makes your heart happy. Because we do things to make us happy. And if you've made a really scrappy quilt, you may not have enough of everything left. You may end up doing a scrappy border, a scrappy binding, and sewing all of your leftover bits and pieces, cutting them down into 2.5, 2¼ inch strips, sewing them together, and using that for a binding. That would be awesome. I've done scrappy bindings before. Have you done that, Katie?
I haven't yet, but it is on my list of things to try along with.
It's really fun. I mean, as long as you're going scrappy, go all the way. Whatever it is that you want. Sometimes you want to just pull it out. I mean, you might want to pull something like putting a dark gray grunge around the outer border that doesn't exist anywhere in the quilt, just to give it a really definite frame. It's like putting a frame around your quilt. Think about your binding like a frame.
Awesome. Then we have a few questions relating to the flange. So
Okay.
Linda wants to know, can you make a larger flange so that it shows more?
You probably could, but I don't know what your measurements would be. Now, this does tend to be a little bit wider than your typical binding. If you sew it at the 1/4 inch and wrap it around, it's going to be, I'm going to say you're going to see a good maybe 3/8 instead of, I mean, you're going to have a little bit more than you typically would on a lot of your binding methods. And sometimes I really like that about it. But I just haven't done the math to figure out other sizes. Maybe one of you more mathematically inclined quilters can help with that. What else have we got, Katie?
Okay, and then Becky wants to know, can you still miter your corners if you do the flange binding?
Absolutely, absolutely. Treat it just like if it was a solid piece of fabric. I swear it's going to work out just fine for you. Remember, you're sewing it onto the back, so you're going to sew it on to the back of your project like this. And I'm going to, let me grab some pins.
And to clarify on that, you would miter after you folded it over and ironed it down, correct?
Right, you're going to treat it just like anything else. So you're going to, as you're sewing along, sewing along, you're going to do the same thing when you get to the corner that you normally would. You're going to, oh, now I'm doing it, okay, I'm doing it upside down and backwards. But yes, you're going to treat it just like you normally would. That's the answer. Pretend it's just a solid piece of fabric. Because when you turn it around onto the front, then it's going to work just like it would, again, if you were using a solid piece of fabric. So, and you're going to get to the end, that corner, you're going to fold it just like you normally would, and you're going to just do it like you would if it was a solid piece. You're still going to get your flange, and it's going to line up perfectly for you, too. It's really cool.
And I think that also covers Carol's question on once you put the 2 strips together for the flange, do you iron the binding? And yes, you want to open it up
and open it up. So you're going to press it towards the, don't press it towards the flange side, press it towards the binding side because that's how you're going to fold it. So you are going to press it to one side. You're going to press it all towards the smaller strip that you're going to see more of. It's all upside down and backwards, but it works so well. And we've got videos available on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, on our AccuQuilt website that will walk you through this. Pam's got some great binding tutorials. She did an all binding show not very long ago.
Amy wants to know what you would say is the easiest binding for a beginner.
Do a 2.5-inch strip, and I don't know, see, I think it's easier to finish it by hand, but I know I'm probably in the minority with that. But I would just go with a standard 2.5-inch strip. And I will tell you that it was probably years of me binding quilts before I didn't pull up a picture or a tutorial on how to go around those corners to get that mitered look. So don't worry about it. That's why we made YouTube, right? It's great for those tutorials. Go to Pinterest, save a picture when you're doing it. Same thing when you're joining your ends, when you're finishing off your binding. I quite often will pull up a reference picture on that too. It's okay. There's no quilt police, right?
Another question on flange.
Yes?
Is the flange towards the quilt or away from the quilt?
So you're gonna sew it onto the back with the flange towards the quilt so that when you roll it onto the front, you see your design. And if you're in doubt, lay it out how you think it is, put some pins where you think the seam allowance is, and see if it folds over and looks right. And if it doesn't, switch it.
And you don't have to hand sew that, correct? You could
No, then you're gonna basically, that's kind of the beauty of this, is that then you get a great finished look by coming back and doing stitch in the ditch, literally right down along that tiny little seam line right there. You're never gonna see that on the front of your quilt. You'll have just a basic a line on the back, and who's gonna notice that? Nobody, nobody. It's a great way to finish your quilts because I used to struggle with machine, not liking how it looked if I machine finished them. I liked the no-look method with the hand sewing it, and then I discovered flange binding. And it kind of changed my whole world as far as machine finishing because it's super easy to just stitch in the ditch. And if you've got that stitch in a ditch foot, it's even better. How are we doing, Katie?
We have one last question.
Okay.
And we're all caught up. So do you like to sew flange binding on the front by machine or by hand?
Oh, if I do flange, I always finish it all on my machine. I don't finish that by hand. That's one of the benefits of doing the flange. And I will do that sometimes on bed quilts, again, that are gonna get washed a little bit more. But yeah, that's the advantage to that, is that it's a really easy way to finish them all off. Great questions, everybody. Well, now remember, if you are just getting started, it's not a problem. We really encourage you to put your own special touches on this project. I'm following the pattern. Pam is making hers larger. But whatever you want to do, there are great versions of it out there. We are seeing such amazing quilts on the Facebook group. Now, that's really, to me, the fun of doing this as a quilt-along, is seeing what everybody else is doing and all of us working on it together. And again, that group is the AQS Quilting Project Parade. It's on Facebook. It is a group page. You just, request an invite. They'll get you approved. You can post your pictures every step along the way, your fabric choices, your blocks, and always, always, always be sure you use hashtag AQSews in your comments so that we can search and look those up. Pam and I have both been popping on to that page really regularly. We've posted pictures. We love seeing what you all are up to. Pam is going to be seen as AccuQuilt cutting expert Pam Heller. I'm going to be seen as AccuQuilt Erica. And I'm also posting pictures on Instagram. I'm Erica LMB. You can be sure that you use, again, that hashtag AQSews on all your social media so that everyone can search hashtag AQSews and see all the different posts. All right, anything last?
Last question. 'Cause
Okay.
I'm interested in this one too.
Okay.
So Patty wants to know, she's seen different ways of adding binding to the quilt. Some people will say to sew it on the front of the quilt and fold it to the back. Others say to do the opposite. What's the difference?
You know, if you're going to machine finish it, I think you're better off sewing it on the back, wrapping it around to the front to machine finish it. Because if you do it the other way around, you might not catch all of the edge. It might not be, it works better. If you're hand finishing it, I think it, again, looks better to sew it, machine stitch it onto the front, wrap it around to the back, and do the hand finishing on the back. It's just going to be a cleaner look. That way you're not going to see any stitches at all on that front. So that's really kind of the difference is if you're doing a combination, hand and machine and hand, I'll sew it on the front, wrap it to the back. If I'm doing it all by machine, I'm going to sew it onto the back, finish it by machine on the front. Great question.
And that wraps us up.
Does that make sense? Does that make sense to you? If it
Makes sense to me,
you,
yeah.
okay. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody else. Now don't forget to also check out the blog, AccuQuilt's blog. I have a post for every part of the Quilt-Along series. It goes over the details from today's event. While you're there, be sure you're signed up so that you get notified whenever there's a new blog post. AQS has been updating their original blog post, so you can check that out as well. Again, their original post ran on March 29th. Now, quilters, before we finish part 4 of our Quilt-Along for the Go Scrappy Star Log Cabin, we have to announce the winner of today's giveaway. Katie, do you want to do the honor since you're here?
Oh, sure.
All right, so,
Mary P. of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
oh, congratulations, Mary, great. Okay, I wonder if she has, if you already have a Scrappy Star Log Cabin and you don't have a 1.5-inch strip die, that's what I would suggest getting with, put that towards that strip die. Well, congratulations. Now, as always, quilters, we've got special offers available for you on our website. To get an order in right now, open a tab on your browser, type in AccuQuilt.com/party. You'll see the current deals. You can place that order. You can also find a store locator on our website and use that to locate a local dealer near you. Now, this is a great way to find that local retailer, to connect with a local AccuQuilt community there as well. A lot of them have clubs and classes, and it's a great way to stay connected with AccuQuilt and learn more. Katie, any last questions?
No, we are all caught up. So.
We're all caught up. Fabulous. All right. Well, it's time for me to go get ready for our next show. Now, next Wednesday, Pam will be back. We will be showcasing pictures of your quilts. So be sure you're posting pictures of them again on that AQS Quilting Project Parade Facebook group page and using hashtag AQSews. I hope today's show was just what you needed to help you finish off your Scrappy Star Log Cabin quilt. But remember, you don't have to be finished to post a picture and just share it. We want to see it all along the way. We want you to relax and enjoy making this really fun project. See you next time.
Thanks so much for watching. To learn more about your quilting craft, be sure to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel for live events every Tuesday and Wednesday. You can check out the events page on the AccuQuilt website for more details on upcoming shows. And if you're looking for even more inspiration, visit our blog for exclusive tutorials filled with tips and tricks. And remember, at AccuQuilt, we help you cut time so you can quilt more.
Check out our events page to see all of our upcoming events. Enter your email to sign up for notifications. Signing up means you're entered to win a door prize that we'll be giving away during the show, so you'll want to join us to see if you won. Tune in Tuesdays at 12 noon Central Time for launch parties and trunk shows. These events are filled with more tips, tricks, and inspiration. Next time, we'll be having a launch party for May's Die to Try Series Die. And be sure to join Pam every Wednesday at 12 noon Central Time for AccuQuilt Live. Next week, Pam and I will be having a show and tell with everyone's finished Scrappy Star Log Cabin quilts. Can't wait to see you there.